Welcome to another episode of the Health Bridge podcast. I am your host, Holly B, and I'm thrilled as always to have you here. Today, I have a great conversation with Nick Motycka. After a 23-year career as a law enforcement officer in Calgary, Nick experienced a breakthrough, formerly known as a breakdown, and was diagnosed with severe PTSD. His profound healing journey was catalyzed by the transformative power of plant medicines. With intention and a strong desire to do the work, Nick was able to overcome severe PTSD, reclaim his life, and embark on a path of post traumatic growth and personal empowerment. Nick left the only profession he ever knew to pursue his dream of creating consciously made natural fiber clothing through his brand of Flow State Designs. Now he shares his story to inspire others, highlighting the potential of plant medicine as a tool for healing, personal transformation, and living in alignment. Nick and I don't hold back. We dive deep into his experience of 23 years of collecting traumas from different parts of his career, from being in drug enforcement, in the gang unit, in undercover situations, and how he'd have to basically act against his natural instincts of seeking safety in order to do his job properly. All of those small to large traumas just stacked up inside until they simply overflowed and he couldn't keep the situation managed anymore. That is when Nick went through his breakthrough. And once he recognized that, he was ready and willing to change, to learn, to figure out how to transmute his traumas. We're going to dive into that plant medicine journey and what actually happened as he moved past that, how his life opened up, how he found his voice to speak his truth, and what his life has turned into since. We talk a lot actually about his ability now to share his truth and speak out loud and share in public ways, his experience of being in Canada right now, what that looks like politically, and how it goes against everything that he grew up to believe that he was doing his job for as a police officer, as someone there to protect the citizens of this country. Before we dive into this, if you would take just a moment to like and subscribe to this podcast from whatever platform you are listening in from. When you choose to like and subscribe and share our podcast episode, you could be making a huge difference in getting that message out there further for somebody to listen to this message and have their life changed because of it. Now let's jump into the episode with Nick Motycka. Nick, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and being on the Health Bridge podcast. I'm really excited to touch on a lot of really interesting points with your stories.
Thank you very much for having me and giving me the time and space to share my story.
Absolutely. So I want to jump right in. And with your story, you talk about kind of your breakdown slash breakthrough moment. And my coach, Kaylor Betts, who also has an incredible podcast, always talks about with his guests, their breakdown to breakthrough moments. And you've described it more as your formerly known as breakdown moments, now known as your breakthrough. So I'm curious if you could kind of start by giving us the backstory of sort of what led up to your formerly known as your breakdown. And kind of what led to your reframing to that was actually your breakthrough.
Yeah, absolutely. So my breakdown moment happened after a 15 plus year career in law enforcement. And so during that career, I collected several different traumas along the way that I never actually processed. And so what I would do is as a police officer, I would go, to the call and deal with whatever situation it was. And then there was no space or time to actually go in and process what I had experienced. And so I would just push it down. Anytime it would come up, I'd be reminded, whether it be a location or a sound or a smell, I would be reminded of it, and I would go there very, very briefly and know immediately, like, okay, yeah, this is a dirty one. This is something I'm not comfortable feeling or thinking about right now. And I would just push it right back down and just kind of tell myself, no, no, we'll deal with that one on another day. And of course, that day was never coming. And so that was my coping strategy, was just to push it down and hold it in and not allow any sort of, those tougher feelings to come in. And so that served its purpose for me through my career. And then on a morning in September of 2020, my cup, however you want to look at it, that's how I look at it, is my cup filled up on that day. And it was a small, sort of insignificant thing that I was dealing with as a police officer. And that little event was just like the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And in that moment, my cup filled up. And I knew that my coping strategy of pushing down trauma and not ever addressing it had run its course, and it wasn't serving me anymore. And it was time to actually go in and process those traumas that were still living in my body and affecting me in my day-to-day life. And so that felt very much like a breakdown and looked like a breakdown from the outside, but it was exactly what I needed to wake myself up, to realize that by just ignoring these things, that wasn't going to work in the long term. And so I needed that full kind of slap across the face to wake me up to go in and actually process this stuff. So with that lens, the breakdown actually led to so many breakthroughs in my life and on my healing journey, because without that kind of low point, I wouldn't have done the work that I've done subsequently, and I wouldn't be in the place I'm at right now, and all of the post-traumatic growth and all of the things and the amazing people that have come into my life since that moment wouldn't have happened.
You talked about collecting traumas, and I find that to be an interesting analogy, because typically when we collect things, it's like things we like, things we enjoy, things that bring value to us, like antiques or things that have certain memorable qualities for certain points in our lives. I'm curious, why do you think people are sort of prone to actually collecting these traumas? Big, from small to large, there are these things that we collect along the way of our lives, and they don't hold that same type of value to us. But I was also thinking that in a way, they hold even more value, depending on how you look at it, right? Because as you said, it led to your breakthrough. I wonder if we could also say that, like, our higher self or God's plan actually intended for us to collect these things in order to spur us into that breakthrough moment.
Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it. And I actually tend to agree with that statement, that it was all part of the plan to get you to where you needed to be on your soul's purpose and all those things that you just mentioned. Because without those harder times and adversities and different things, like, you're not the same person. They shape you and form you and forge you into the person, and they give you that resiliency and the strength and all of that you wouldn't otherwise have if you weren't tested and kind of been put through it a little bit. And then just to back up a little bit on the talking about collecting traumas, for me, it was something I was exposed to and something that I took on and didn't ever release or allow to move through me, just by the nature of police work, and then also by my own nature and the way I was raised, of just like, new, like, emotions, no, we're going to keep those all inside. There's no talking about those kind of things. And so though there was nowhere for it to go other than to collect inside of me, up until the point where that was no longer sustainable. So yeah, you touched on a number of interesting points there, but yeah, that's kind of how I frame it anyways.
Yeah, when we hold on to these things energetically, they get really lodged into our nervous system, right? And it kind of creates this stagnation in the body. It might not be something physical, but it can cause physical results. And we have to, if we don't learn tools as we're growing up with ways to kind of transmute that and move things through, they get lodged in there. So you're saying that you basically got to this point where everything was stagnated to the point where your cup was completely full. You couldn't take any more. Did you recognize, well, it's interesting that you recognized in the moment that where that straw broke the camel's back. So tell me kind of what that was like. Were you thinking about that almost from an outside point of view, like looking in, or, do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And it was, so I'll just kind of describe the kind of the moments that led up to my breakthrough, and then how that day and then the weeks and months unfolded past there. So on a morning in September, like I mentioned, of 2020, I opened my laptop. Actually, I was working from home at this point because it was, lockdowns and people were working from home. And so even as a police officer, I was now in a role where I was working from home, which was amazing because for the majority of my career, I worked in different drug enforcement units and gang suppression this and undercover drug roll this and like all these really kind of pointy end of the stick sort of roles. And so now all of a sudden I was sitting behind a computer at home working, digitally. And so I wasn't having to deal with the drug dealers and the gang members and all the things. And then ironically, that was what was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so on that morning, I saw some messages that had come in overnight from a young lady who was suicidal. And it was a cry for help. And a lot of the hard ones, the hard calls that I'd collected throughout my career were suicide related. So it's not a coincidence at all that this one was as well. And so when I saw those messages, for the first time, my world just like kind of came crashing in on me, and to like this really small area of where I was able to focus, and I wasn't able to act at all. I was just staring blankly at my computer screen in this kind of catatonic state that I'd never experienced before. And so that really was jarring to me, like having an experience like that, because as you can imagine in policing, that wouldn't be a desirable trait, of course, if you're out dealing with, dangerous people out on the street. Shutting down is the opposite of what you want to be able to do. And so it was really jarring in that sense. And then, so I was staring blankly at my screen, and I don't even know how long that was for, until actually my wife came into the room and saw me and recognized that something was up, and she was able to kind of snap me out of it. And I was just like, okay, so now I'm back in kind of reality. And I know that something that had never happened to me before had just happened, and that I knew what it was. It was very obvious that it was trauma related, like what I had just witnessed or had dealt with in terms of these messages, and then like the theme of it and all of that. And so what I did as I kind of came back into reality was I knew I needed to call my supervisor, number one. And so that's what I did. I called her up, and it was actually a civilian at that time that was my boss. And I, for the first time as an adult, fully broke down crying. I cried for the first time as an adult on the phone with this lady. So that must have been a hard conversation for her as well, because I'm trying to explain to her what's going on, and I don't even understand what's happening to me in that moment exactly. But I knew that this was unusual and something that needed to be paid attention to, just because of the whole nature of it and the experience. And so I first had a knowing that I needed to get out into nature. And so that's what I did. I drove west of Calgary, the city we were living in or close to, and just like out into the Rocky Mountains, and spent the day on the banks of it's called the Elbow River, right by a waterfall, and just kind of sat there, and I journaled, and I just thought about all the things that were important to me and what wasn't important to me anymore, and just kind of got my life in my head at least straight. And then it was during that time in nature that I decided that, okay, I'm not going to go back to work until I've successfully dealt with whatever the heck just happened to me this morning. And so that's what I did. I just set off on this unknown path and just completely let my hands off the wheel, and just let whatever happened. And that was something that was very outside of my nature. I'm usually, trying to hold on really tight and control outcomes and all that, which is super common, but it was definitely a thing for me. And so that's kind of how that day unfolded. And then with that knowing at the end of the day that it was time to go in and deal with stuff.
So, starting from that point, walk us through your path towards your healing journey, because you had quite an incredible one-time healing journey that really made turned your life around. But what steps did you take leading up to that? Because I think it took you a while to figure out the right path for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So after the breakthrough, I again had my hands off the wheel and just allowed whatever help was coming in to come in. And so because it happened at work, right? It was a workplace injury. So there was lots of different people I needed to talk to, of course, like insurance companies and WCBs and all the internal psychologists. And so they were setting me up with different psychological appointments and different professionals. And so I was just like, yeah, like sign me up. Like I'll talk to whoever. I want to find someone that can help me get back to myself, because I had realized that it had taken a lot of years to kind of get to that point, but it was if with hindsight, it was coming for quite a long time. It was my sleep was messed up for a number of years. My mood and the way I was showing up as in the world, as a father, as a police officer, as all the things, I just wasn't showing up as the best version of myself. My patience wasn't there. My ability to deal with adversity had really, really taken where I had a really hard time making decisions, like, even silly things like what's for dinner, like, or what do you want for dinner? And I just like, oh, I don't even want to like have to make another decision after a day at work. And so that had really gotten to a low point. And then my ability to deal with any sort of violence or anything was like not there at all. I couldn't watch any sort of violence on TV or movies or even listen to music with aggressive lyrics. And so it had, yeah, really affected me in a lot of ways in my life. And it again had taken a long time to get to that point. So I wasn't really aware of it up until that point. And so I was just talking to all these psychologists and open to whatever they were offering. And so it was traditional talk therapies, it was exposure therapies, it was the EMDR, the eye movement desensitization stuff. I was doing that, and I was all in. Like I was doing all the work that they were asking me to. But it got to a point where I felt like I was just regurgitating my traumas. When it was a story, and it was something I was just telling a story, and it wasn't doing anything internally. Like it wasn't processing it or anything. I was just reiterating it without any benefit, I guess. And so that went on for a year, almost a year and a half, where I went through a few different psychologists trying to find, something different with a different practitioner. And what I really found that I was missing personally, because my spiritual journey and awakening was really happening all at the exact same time. So I was really missing a spiritual or an energetic component to the healing practices that I was being offered, because what I was getting was like a very mechanistic view of the human body, where it's just like with no attention or even any sort of priority given to energy or frequency or spirituality or any of that. So that was something I was missing. And so a year and a half in, I was at a real low point. It was in terms of my mental health and how I felt. And it was just, yeah, wasn't in a good place at all. And then one morning in December of 2021, I had basically been backed up against a wall by WCB at that point. They were really pushing me hard to return to work. And they, at that time, had given me about a 48-hour window to decide what I was going to do. Was I going to go back to work, or was I going to? And so in that moment, I knew that I needed something different. And what I thought I needed was a shaman who was also a psychologist. And so that seed had been planted a few months earlier by my wife, who I also call my oracle because she is. She had told me that again a couple months prior, and I was like, maybe not ready to quite hear it at that time. And so had convinced myself now in the moment that I had thought of this brilliant idea that I needed a shamanist and a psychologist, but she definitely thought of it. So I just Googled it and I found one, and she happened to be in the city that we were in. And so I called her up in that moment and not knowing what else to do. And we kind of went back and forth a little bit, and then she agreed to help me. And so we arranged a healing journey with psilocybin. So what I had this intuitive knowing that plants were going to be a part of my healing. I was very adverse to any sort of a pharmaceutical along my whole journey. And I'm not saying that they don't have their place for different people, but for me, it wasn't for me. And that wasn't for lack of doctors, offering them to me, that's for sure. But I just wanted to keep it as natural as possible. And so I had actually started growing my own mushrooms about 3 months prior to that December timeframe. And that was again on an intuitive knowing that these plants, this mushroom was going to be a part of my healing journey. And so that's what I did. I just started growing them, and I grew them on a sacred geometry clearing plate, and I was doing Reiki on them and setting clear intention that whatever I was going to do with them, which I didn't know what that was going to look like at that point, I was just setting that intention that they were going to be part of my healing. And so we arranged the healing journey for January 28th of 2022, which, no coincidence, was my wife and I's 10-year wedding anniversary. And also the Freedom Convoy in Canada was on their way across the country, heading to our nation's capital in Ottawa to protest government overreach with mandates and the whole craziness of the past few years in Canada. And so as someone who truly respects people's rights, in Canada, it's called your charter rights. It's you call it your constitution. So it's the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And as a police officer, from day one, it was drilled into me how important people's rights were. And you can't mess with them, because if you do, there's remedies. And in the criminal system, that means that the charges are going to go away. Like whatever, even if they were the worst person in the world, it doesn't matter. Like those charges are gone because you breached someone's charter rights. And now all of a sudden our government was just trampling people's charter rights, literally in Ottawa, as we saw later. And so, but at that point, the convoy was just on their way. And all of a sudden I was realizing that I wasn't alone in how I was feeling, because they did a really good job of keeping us all isolated and we didn't realize how many other people were out there feeling the same way that we were. And so there was just a really hopeful time. And so no coincidence at all that was all happening at the exact same time as my healing journey. And then I'll just back up just a smidge. So being that my shaman is also a PhD psychologist, she did all the standard testing on me through the DSM and all that. And so I came back as diagnosed PTSD, and I was on the severe side of the spectrum, or whatever you want to call it. And so January 28th, my wife and I traveled to Calgary. We weren't living there at the time. And all of that spirituality and that energetic component that I was missing in my traditional healing was like front and center now. It's like a shaman-led, just beautiful ceremony with drumming and calling in of protection from angels, unicorns, fairies. Like it was next level. And I love that stuff. And so I was like really feeling good, because now I'd finally found a practitioner who was speaking my language. And so I brought the medicine that I had grown with those intentions and with that sacred geometry and with the Reiki and all of that. I brought that with me, of course, and I held it to my heart, and I read my intentions that I had written out in my journal. I read that 3 times forcefully, and my intentions were to actually go in and process unresolved stuff from my policing career, all this trauma that I had never revisit it. I wanted to actually go back and process. And so I read those intentions with that medicine. And when I say medicine, I 100% mean medicine, because that's what it is. It is a very, very powerful healing tool when used with the right intention, in the right set and setting, and all of that. And it has the potential to help so many people. So, but I'll get into that later. So I took that medicine, and I, without any resistance, without even thinking about it, well, first of all, I went into the bedroom of the place we were in, and I just went like actually right underneath the covers. And I went back to the first chronological trauma that I had from early days in my career I was with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, prior to the Calgary Police Service. And so went back really early in my career, and it was a suicide related call. And it was the first time I ever went back there willingly. And again, this was with no resistance, not even like no conscious thought about it at all. I went there as naturally as breathing. And I saw it from a different perspective, number one. And it was that I had a realization that I was a witness to someone else's trauma story, and me holding on to it, 15 years later, certainly wasn't helping the person involved. And it obviously wasn't helping myself either. And so that was a big realization for me. And then the second part, which was even more important, was what I can only now describe as radical Jesus level compassion for the people involved. So in that particular scenario, compassion for this young lady who had tried to kill herself, and what her trauma story must have looked like to get her to that point to do that to herself. So I had this just overwhelming sense of compassion for her, and also for myself, in that I, as naive as this sounds, I actually joined policing and started in policing to try and help people. And so compassion for myself, in that I was just trying to help. And so with those three things, the perspective and then that compassion for the people and myself, it just finally processed. It was, like I said, the first time I ever went back to actually kind of revisit those memories, and with the high vibration of compassion, and also that perspective shift, it just moved. It just finally processed. And then once that it felt kind of complete, and then I just went chronologically to the next one from my career, and then worked through that one in the same way, and then on through my 15-year plus career in policing. And I came out of the ceremony. It was a few hours later, and it wasn't like a switch had been flipped, of course. Like, it had taken a lot of years to get to that point. So it took some time for integration and whatnot to get to feel better, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But it definitely felt profound even in the moment. And the psychologist, so she was coming in regularly, checking on me, and I didn't know what that ceremony was going to look like, or what the session was going to look like, in terms of how much intervention she was going to have to do, like how much talking we were going to be doing back and forth and working me through things. But for me, with the energy I put into the medicine of, all the things I described, and then also my own willingness to want to go in and just deal with this stuff, it just did exactly what I asked it to do, kind of like magic. It's almost like they're properly named, being called magic mushrooms for sure. And so outside of that ceremony, some time went by. It was about a week and a half went by, and I was feeling pretty good. And at that time frame, the Freedom Convoy had gotten to Ottawa, and now we were starting to see images come back from Ottawa on how how the government, and therefore the police, were dealing with peaceful protesters. And what I saw on, I believe it was February 8th of 2022, was images of the police in Ottawa stealing fuel from the truckers. And it's miserable Canadian cold February, just gross. And so the only way that they're able to stay there is staying in their vehicles, using fuel, right, to keep themselves warm. And so now the government and therefore the police are stealing fuel. And for me, it was just a line in the sand had been crossed with my own integrity, morals, ethics, whatever you want to call it, in that now I was seeing like just the government, well, and the police, then therefore my brothers and sisters in law enforcement were like just trampling people's rights, their rights to protest and all that. And so on that day, about a week and a half after my healing journey, I wrote a letter to other police officers, just asking them to really like think about what they were doing in terms of enforcement there. And then after I wrote that out, I thought I'll just record myself reading this thing. And so I did. And this was something I'd never done before. So I recorded myself reading it, and then I posted it to a group I was part of that was other police officers that were feeling the same way I was. And then I went to bed and I didn't really think anything of it. And then I woke up and my video had kind of taken on a life of its own at that point. And so it's crazy to look at it now with a little bit of hindsight in the time frame. So like I said, a week and a half after my healing journey, I felt empowered enough to speak my truth for the first time in my life, actually, like to go against my profession or the government or whatever. And so it's interesting to look at that, the time frame now. And then about a month after that time frame, WCB had ordered a comprehensive psych assessment to check in on where I was with my mental health. And they, of course, had no idea what I had done in terms of a healing journey with mushrooms and a shaman. Like that was all something I had to do on my own and pay for myself and all that. And so I went and did this half a day appointment with this independent psychologist and all the testing again and interviews and all of that. And she called me back a week later and let me know that I didn't even meet the criteria for a diagnosis anymore. So I'd went from severe PTSD in early January, one healing journey, and then 6 weeks later, I didn't meet the criteria for a diagnosis. So the evidence is abundantly clear for me that this plant, again, when combined with a strong intention and all of those things I've talked about, the energies and whatnot that I put into it and the willingness to go in and process stuff, is just a very, very powerful healing force, and has psilocybin and other psychedelics as well. But for me, psilocybin specifically, it has so much potential to help so many people. I just have this deep knowing that unresolved trauma is at the root of so many problems that we see in the world with individuals and in our societies. And this medicine just has so much potential to help people. And so that's why I'm so grateful to be on shows like yourself or like yours, where I can share my story and let people know that this is a possibility. And I'm not saying it's for everyone, but if you want to go in and deal with root cause trauma and process this stuff, it's an amazing natural way to successfully process trauma.
I've had several other people on my podcast as well that have also brought up the potential for healing, some of whom have used it themselves, some of whom are in the studying and learning, scientific phase of the process. And it really is fascinating. It seems to be that the science is really starting to show that we have been going about healing physically and emotionally, and especially with like pain syndromes as well, going about things totally the wrong way. Have people been helped? Of course they have in other modalities, but like the implications going down this path are huge. So I love that you're speaking to this. You talked about trauma being essentially the root cause of all of our personal problems as well as society's problems. I think that there's a lot of generational trauma that has gone on. I'm curious if you've done any work around your own personal generational trauma, whether that means stemming through the generations of your family or just, Gen Z, Gen X, like all the baby boomers, like we all bring on our own, as a society, we bring on our own traumas, I think, that go along with technological advancements, societal advancements, and all the other things. So I'm curious if you've done some work into this, some thought into this.
Yeah, I mean, generational trauma is scientifically proven real. It's a real thing. And so I'll just describe a study that I'm aware of that like just really paints this with a highlighter. And so it was in 2018. It was in the US and at a university in the US. And they took a mouse and they exposed it to the smell of cherry blossom, essential oil, and then they gave it a shock, an electric shock. And so obviously it had a trauma response physically, and then they measured the blood of the mouse and they saw that there was a cortisol spike, and so a measurable trauma response in the mouse. And then they took that mouse and then bred it subsequent generations. And so they tested then its offspring, and what they would do is they'd expose it to the cherry blossom smell and then test its blood to see if there was a trauma response. And they found that there was a measurable trauma response 14 generations later with no shock, just the smell alone. So it's like, of course, like generational trauma is a real thing. And of course, we don't have memories of the things that happened to our ancestors and generations before us, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't still live in our DNA, in our genetics, in our body. And so it's just really cool time to be alive, because all this stuff is coming out and is actually being able to be shown with science that it's well, not only real, but there's ways to deal with it. And psilocybin is one of them. But I've recently done some breath work stuff around generational trauma, and it was profound and super intense and amazing. And so it's just really cool that you're able to go in and deal with just multiple generations of trauma in an hour and a bit breathwork session. And I've been able to meet the healed version of my mom and the healed version of my dad in a breathwork session, and then have 14 generations of people that came before me that if they wouldn't have existed, I wouldn't exist in the same way. And they, in this breathwork session, they're all cheering me on to heal this stuff because they lived their lives. And if you go back 14 generations, like we're talking like better part of 1,000 years. So you can imagine the things that humans were exposed to: wars and famines and plagues and witch hunts, and like just awful things happened over the past 1,000 years. And so they collected all these traumas, and then it's unfortunately getting passed down. And now in this moment, they're all cheering me on to heal it, because until one generation goes in and actually heals this stuff, it now falls onto the next generation. It falls onto our kids to either heal it or else carry it on and pass it on to the next generation. And I'm just very ready to stop that and to give the next generation just the best chance moving forward without being just hindered by this generational stuff that it's only hurting, of course, at this point.
So many things that I want to touch on with what you said. The first being just that I love that you said that it's such an exciting time to be alive, because I think, what we see on the news right now, it's like could easily be interpreted as, such a terrible time to be alive. Like there's just so much craziness that's happening on so many different levels, right? But part of the point of me even having this podcast, of me being a coach, of me talking to people like you, is to share this information of the amazing healing possibilities that are out there on so many different levels and through so many different modalities. And the more we can build ourselves up, physically and emotionally and spiritually, the more we can feel confident, like you all of a sudden, after going through your healing ceremony, felt the confidence to be able to speak your truth around what was happening with the convoy. And so the more that we can all build each other up in that sense, the more we can all speak our truth, and the more we can stop this craziness, or at least find remedies for this craziness that's going on around us.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is. It's a crazy time to be alive. And I I'm at the point now where I feel a lot of hope for the future because of the craziness. And the way I look at it is, so the collective consciousness is rising. Like it just is. There's more and more people awakening all the time. And I feel like we're getting close to a tipping point where things are going to just start exponentially happening. And so as the collective rises, the vibration of what we've lived in up until this point, all the corruption and all the just terrible things that are happening to keep us down, are all coming up to the surface because they're vibrating at a lower frequency and they can't exist in these higher frequencies that we're moving into. And so they're all being kind of shook to the surface in order to be transmuted and alchemized into something better. And what I feel that's going to be is love, because we've lived in fear for so long, and the opposite of fear is love. And so it's crazy, and it's going to get crazier before we are at a better place. But at the same time, I just feel a lot of hope for the future, and like short-term future too. I'm talking like our lifetime. I'm not here to see this drag on for more generations, for sure.
Absolutely. And the fact that you have experienced the ability of the healing, and you can now see in hindsight behind you for those 14 generations, it gives you the ability to see what can be, and that's so powerful. We need that hope. We need that. Yeah, we need that hope in our lives in order to step up and make a difference. Because if we don't have any hope, why bother? Right. And I love that you said this. It's like this craziness is supposed to happen. It gives us the platform to keep stepping up and to keep showing up. And like you said, that collective consciousness is rising. And I do see it. I know I mentioned earlier my coach Kaylor Betts, and I know that you're well aware of him as well. And he's up in Canada too, part of that truth seeker movement, part of that awake, not woke, the
New.
awake, the awake community. And it's been a journey for me going through that as well. For me here, where I really started tuning into that upheaval of everything was back, what was it, 2016, when I think it was when Trump first was elected. And boy, has my experience and my understanding of what was happening then versus what I've seen play out since then has shifted like 180 degrees. I mean, I thought that was like the end of the world, and I've come really full circle. And I'm not saying I think Trump is like, I want to put him on a pedestal by any means, but I can see now what that brought to the surface, and the things that I thought it was bringing to the surface as the bad things, it was kind of the opposite. It's been a really fascinating process to be able to see from such a different perspective now how much we have been hampered, how much has the wool has been pulled over our eyes, and I just accepted so much of it as truth, and I can't see it that way anymore. And so with people like you speaking your truth, the word gets out further and further and further and creates that ripple effect. And I think we're making some people nervous in the higher realms of the government.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that's, again, I think another reason why we're seeing so much chaos is because they're just like holding on by their fingernails at this point, and just you can see their desperation, and there is no other outcome other than truth. Truth wins. And we've just been lied to for far too long. And as time moves on, we're just going to see more and more truth. And as that happens, the corrupt systems that are in place currently are just going to fall away, because they have to. They're not here for they're not here to benefit us. They're not here for love. They're not here for in harmony with nature. Like, they need to go. So it's coming, but it's going to be a ride. So
Yeah, buckle up. Absolutely. I want to get into how this has kind of transformed your path as an entrepreneur. But first, I do have one more question around your journey. You were talking about how you grew your own plants and you put all this intention and you used Reiki and you used the geometric grids. And did you have already a basis of knowledge around those things, or were you kind of gathering those things as you went because you were kind of grasping for the more of that spiritual experience?
yeah, I say a little bit of that for sure. So my spiritual awakening started in early 2020, actually in January of 2020, and it started with meditation and a major diet change. So my wife and I, we both did it at the same time, and which has been really cool to be on the same journey throughout this past few years. And then for me, actually, cannabis played a role as well in just shifting some perspective stuff for me. And so those three factors have really accelerated my spiritual awakening. And so I mean, I did take a Reiki course kind of in that 2020 sort of time frame, and the rest of the spiritual stuff, like the sacred geometry, I'm just at a point where it's just like, when something feels true to me and feels good to me, I just for it, and I don't question it or research it too much. I just kind of go with my gut instinct on it. And so that's where I was. I didn't have any formal training on how to bless mushrooms or anything like that. I just was winging it, but it worked out really good for me. So I'm going to just keep doing that.
Yeah, I think that's really neat because, well, you trusted your intuition for one, but it seems to me that your higher self knew that you were on this journey towards that breakdown or breakthrough. And you instinctively were gathering tools along the way, even though you didn't really realize how it was going to come to helping you at that pivotal moment. So I just think that's a really neat part of your journey. And also to point out that for other people that might be listening that don't, they're like, well, I don't know anything about energy healing. All I've done is Western medicine to heal my diagnosis. And, that's not really working, but I don't know about this woo woo stuff. Well, it doesn't need to be woo woo. It does it feel good or does it not? Does it feel like it supports you or does it not? There's nothing wrong with just dipping your toe in and learning about this stuff. We don't need to go all the way to growing your own mushrooms to start, right? Like you started with maybe a little Reiki course and just exploring that because it was interesting to you. So I just want to put that out to our listeners as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, it was so for me, trusting my instinct and trusting my intuition was something I had to kind of relearn, because in policing, especially when I was working in like an undercover role, I was ignoring my intuition as a profession. Like anytime I'd go to get in a drug dealer's car, I mean, my intuition would be screaming at me like, no, don't get in there. Like, that's not safe. Like, you don't want to get in that car. But I would just have to say, like, shut up, intuition, and get in there, because that was my job. And so this past few years has really been a process of strengthening that muscle, in a sense, the intuition muscle, and hearing it, and then actually proving that I heard it in terms of taking steps in the real world to in that along the knowings that I'm getting. And so it's been an interesting process to go from completely ignoring my intuition to now just like blindly trusting whims like growing mushrooms and all the other things that have come along in the last few years.
Do you ever wonder, and obviously I think that the path that we end up on is the path we're supposed to be on, but do you ever wonder, had you had the instinctive push to explore Reiki or these other, energetic concepts prior to you being so deep in the police department, if that could have helped you as a police officer, or do you think it would have sent you in out of that world and into another much earlier?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I I think for certain people they could coexist, the spiritual world and policing. For me, I don't see how I could be doing both. Just like because I'm so sensitive to energies now, like any sort of, confrontation or, you know, angry people is like, oh, like it just feels terrible to me. And even going into a room where there's, some angst is just doesn't feel good to me at all. And so I would have a really hard time with it. But I can also see how there's a lot of tools that I've gained that would help me get through some stuff. But at the same time, it for me, I don't see how I could do both.
And so now you are no longer. Talk to us about that transition and what you're doing now.
Yeah. So when that doctor called me back and told me that I didn't meet the criteria for a diagnosis, my benefits stopped in that moment, right? Because now I don't have a diagnosis. And so the Calgary Police Service was the agency I was working for at the time. They were like, okay, well, cool, you're good. Like, come on back. And it was just, I'll just tell you a crazy story. So at that time, so this is like basically March, April of 2022. And so at that time, we were living 3.5 hours away from Calgary, from the city that I was, policing in and dealing with all my, mental health stuff and healing myself. And so they wanted me to start coming back online to do some requalifications and some training and stuff. And I was going to have to test, like COVID test twice a week. I think it was twice a week, even though I was working remotely from home, 3.5 hours away from the city, even that I was employed by. And so it was just so I can't go back. And for two major reasons. Number one is my own mental health, and I'm feeling really good. But if I were to go back into policing, I would end up re traumatizing myself and be back in the same situation. And number two, I just really morally and ethically have really had a hard time watching what has happened to policing over the past few years with the stuff here in Canada with the Emergencies Act and how the peaceful protesters there were dealt with. And then even on a smaller scale in the city I was policing in, the city got a injunction against peaceful protesters and made it so then the police could physically arrest you for bylaw infractions. So if you stepped off a sidewalk or if you jaywalked or if you committed any bylaw infraction, you could physically be arrested for that. And it was like, I'm not participating in that. Like, I just not. That goes against everything why I became a police officer and what I think it should stand for. And so that combined with my own mental health made my decision as easy as it could be, walking away from the only career I ever knew. But that was the only choice for me. And I was really lucky to have an amazingly supportive wife, and her family have been great. And I've received a lot of support along the way that made that possible. So since that day, I've been just working on bringing my clothing brand to the world. And so that's what keeps me busy these days, besides telling my story of healing. And so and I'll just tell you about my brand. So in early 2020, I was looking for a product in the marketplace, and that was something, I wanted locally made clothing that was made in North America is what I was looking for, and natural fiber. So we're talking like linen, hemp, not any sort of polyester, nothing like that. And I was also looking for something that was just a good fitting quality, just basic men's t-shirt. And I couldn't find it. And there's some really cool brands out there doing good things, but they'd be good t-shirt, but it's polyester blend and it's made in Vietnam. Or another brand would be, maybe made in the US, but still it's got polyester or whatever. I couldn't find all three. And so I just decided early in 2020, along with the whole spiritual journey, I just had this meditation actually where it came to me in my meditation, and I just decided to start making it myself. And so that's what I did. And it took 2.5 years to get from my head to physical form. But it was a really cool thing to have I was working on in the background while I was going through all my healing stuff. And it's just just feels really good to be bringing the best possible product that I can manage at this point, with the best fibers, with made in the best conditions and with the most intention and all of the things. It's something that I'm really proud of what I've been able to accomplish in a short time with no experience at all in fashion. And so I'm really excited to keep evolving and growing and bringing new products and finding ways to be even better and to use even, use less materials, have less impact on the planet, and it just to be something that's good for the people wearing it and also for the planet at large. So that's kind of what we're all about.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Are you actually producing in Canada?
Yeah. So all of our stuff is sewn in Calgary, Alberta, actually. So I'm living in Sylvan Lake, Alberta. So we're about an hour and a half away from where our production facility is.
That's amazing. I don't think I've ever seen a piece of clothing made in Canada.
No, it's like all of our
Yeah,
manufacturing has all been offshored. And I
yeah.
heard a stat that in the mid 80s, 85, I believe it was 85% of all clothing in Canada was made in Canada. It's now 2%. So, and I'm sure it's similar in the US as well.
I'm no doubt. Yeah, there's a few small pockets I think that are made in the US, but yeah, the majority of it is elsewhere in the world. But I'm so thrilled with your brand and what you're doing and the meaning and message behind it. And it's really nice to see how your growth journey and healing journey has kind of come to fruition also like simultaneously and through this brand as well. And I can't wait to see what comes in the future for you. I think you are going to be an incredible spokesperson for not just plant medicine and healing journeys, but also for being a truth speaker. And yeah, I think you have great things ahead. So I'm so honored that you were willing to be here and speak to us today.
Well, thank you very much again for giving me the time and space to share my story. And it's even beyond the clothing. My passion is to share this modality or this potential for people that may or may not otherwise have known about it. And you can do more in an afternoon with a psychedelic assisted therapy session than you could potentially do in a decade of traditional therapy. And I'm not saying that there's still, there's lots of good that comes out of more traditional therapies, but if you're called to this work, it's transformational for sure. So thank you very much.
Of course. And where can people find you?
Yeah, so online is where I'm focusing my efforts. And so the website is flowstatedesigns.ca. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and all the things under Flow State Designs.
Thank you again for sharing with us. And we look forward to following your journey.
Thank you very much. And for what you're doing as well to bring this kind of information to the collective. So podcasting saved us, in my opinion, in the past few years, and was the only place where we could actually get real information that wasn't vetted and filtered and all the things. So thank you for doing what you're doing as well.
Thank you so much for listening into this amazing conversation with Nick. I really want to revisit what he said about generational trauma and unresolved trauma being the root cause of all of the problems in our lives and in society as a whole. It really makes clear that, especially with the study that he referenced, where traumas can stay with us, stay with our family lines for 14 generations. That is wild. That is absolutely wild. It's not just that you have mother or father issues and maybe that came from grandma or grandpa. We're talking teen generations. Do you even know what your ancestry was 14 generations ago? I would say most people probably don't. I hope that that hits home for you and encourages you to really do some of the work for yourself. Find ways of digging in and seeing what traumas may have stuck into your nervous system and rooted in, and what patterns you're holding that maybe are not serving you for your highest and best. Because if they're not serving you for your highest and best, they're not serving the next 14 generations of your line for their higher and best either. The more we can heal ourselves, the more we can contribute to society, the stronger we can be as an individual, as a family unit, as a community, and the more we can affect change all around us. Everything starts with you. Everything starts with your healing, with your breakdown to breakthrough. Some of us don't need to reach an actual breakdown, though. If we are open to starting that process, we can actually circumvent the breakdown. It is a beautiful process, even when it doesn't feel like it in the moment. But looking back after you come through things it causes so much appreciation for the journey and for the lessons learned and the experiences had. Please reach out to myself if you are trying to figure out where to start, or if you connected with Nick's story, please reach out to him as well. All of his information is in the show notes. He was also kind enough to give our listeners a special discount code to enjoy some of his clothing designs. So that will be listed in the notes as well. Christmas is coming up here. So, and the holidays, whichever one you celebrate, that is all coming up soon. So please take advantage of that. Please support a small independent business owner doing amazing things with his brand. And please stay tuned again for the next episode of the Health Bridge podcast.